Good afternoon, everybody. I am Ian Walmsley, the Provost of Imperial College London, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Energy Futures Lab annual lecture. This is the Institute's most prestigious lecture, and it's a highlight of its events program. So it's wonderful that so many of you could join us today from around the world. The Energy Futures Lab is one of seven global institutes at Imperial College London. It was established back in 2005 to address the global energy challenges by identifying and leading new opportunities to serve industry, government, and society through the high impact research, innovation, and education that it provides. Today, the Energy Futures Lab sits at the heart of a vibrant energy research community at the college, spanning the faculties of engineering and natural sciences, as well as the business school. Central to the Institute's mission is the promotion of a systemic solution for sustainable energy future. And this requires a collaborative and highly multidisciplinary approach, combining the development of cutting-edge energy technologies and materials together with the advancement of innovative policies and governance structures. The lab draws upon the strengths of Imperial's leading scientists, engineers, economists, and policy experts, and fosters a collaboration with a wide variety of external partners. This is, of course, of critical importance because technological advances alone will not be able to solve the global challenges of climate change, pollution, or energy access. Now, our speaker today is someone who has a deep understanding of these challenges and the opportunities that exist to meet them, and it is a very great honor to introduce him. Dr. Kandeh Yumkella is a distinguished development economist who served almost 2 decades in the United Nations system, including as Under Secretary General and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All. He was the founding Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Energy for All initiative and served 2 4-year terms as the Director General of the UN Industrial Development Organization. In both of these capacities, he mobilized the global consensus for Sustainable Development Goal 7 on ensuring access to affordable and sustainable energy for all, and Sustainable Development Goal 9 on building resilient infrastructure and promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization. He's also the founder and the CEO of the Energy Nexus Network, a regional ecosystem hub for sustainable energy solutions. And he serves on both the Pan-African Parliament and the Parliament of Sierra Leone. Drawing upon this vast experience, Dr. Yumkella will today discuss the progress that has been made towards achieving SDG 7 and the actions required to scale up clean energy investments, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a region where some of the worst effects of climate change are already being felt, and where lack of access to reliable and affordable modern energy is seriously affecting the delivery of critical health and education services. His lecture, entitled "The Urgency of the Global Energy Transitions in a Post-COVID-19 World Order," couldn't be more timely, just after a month after the first UN high-level dialogue on energy in almost 40 years, and 2 weeks ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. This crucial climate summit will once again place the energy transition at the top of the international agenda. Today's event then is an opportunity to reflect on the global nature of the challenges we face and the importance of multilateral cooperation to ensure a just and inclusive energy transition. It's my great honor to now invite the Honorable Dr. Kandeh Yumkella to deliver the 2021 Energy Futures Lab annual lecture. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Provost Walmsley. Thanks to the Futures Lab at Imperial College for inviting me to share some ideas with you as we prepare to head for your direction there in the UK to go to Glasgow and see how we can raise ambitions to accelerate energy transitions. I use the plural transitions because indeed there are many countries at different stages of development, different stages of energy access, energy security, and therefore the transitions will vary across countries and across regions. Just a few weeks ago, 22nd to 24th of September, the UN convened a high-level summit, first of its kind in 40 years, to look at the progress we've made towards achieving the goal of Sustainable Development Goal number 7, and also to look at energy transitions in general. And of course, the Secretary General used the opportunity to make a global call for action on reducing emissions and dealing with climate change as a prelude to what will happen in Glasgow. This event, next slide please, this summit was organized around 5 working groups, one dealing with energy access, you can also say energy security across the world, energy transitions in general. Number 3, enabling sustainable development goals through inclusive and just transitions, innovation, technology and data, and finally finance. I served on working group 3, but on the sidelines with some of the colleagues at UNDESA that were in charge of and Sustainable Energy for All Secretariat. I also gave some thoughts on from 1 to 5. Looking at the technical documents that were submitted to member states for discussion and then listening in on the conversations. Next slide, please. I synthesized 2 schools of thought when it comes to energy transition. The first one, which seems to be the dominant one, is energy transition was considered as an effort to achieve a decarbonized energy system by 2050. And breaking that down, some ideas were to eliminate all greenhouse gases from the energy sector, to transition from fossil-based fuels to renewables in a balanced process, underline balanced process here, that's an important statement, meeting multiple economic and social priorities at the same time. Those 2 bullets are important. Remember, the UN is a community of nations, and all these words, when you negotiate the politics of energy within the UN, as I had to do for over a decade, every word there matters. Balanced process, meeting economic and social priorities, because countries, again, are at different stages. Some countries want to push more for climate change action. Others are saying, we want to do that, but we also need to develop. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the second school of thought was focusing on achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 7, but with the caveat that it had to be aligned with the Paris Agreement. And breaking that down, they say, fine, as we look at energy transitions, we must also make sure that we achieve the 2030 Development Agenda. The 2030 Development Agenda was the 17 Sustainable Development Goals the Community of Nations agreed on back in 2015. These were the 17 goals that in fact replaced the so-called Millennium Development Goals. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Also, to provide access to the over 700 million that did not have electricity currently, and also underline, and did not have the means of financing the required investments. Very important. You can see that that's the interest of the developing countries, particularly Africa, where most of those that do not have electricity reside. The third issue, which was common to all, was that the pace and scale of transition is country specific, which I have been repeating quite a bit now already, that countries were at different stages in their socioeconomic development. Therefore, the speed and scale of transitions will vary from country to country and region to region. Next slide, please. So if we take the first school of thought, decarbonizing the energy systems, what do we have to do? Between now and 2030, we need to take radical action to be able to ensure that temperature rise is not above 1.5 degrees. To do that, we have to cut emissions by 50% this decade, below 2010 levels. That is what will put us on the trajectory for the so-called net zero by 2050. People define this decade from now till 2030 as the defining decade. If we take the right actions now, we'll be at a point where we say, fine, we've finally been able to tackle climate change by 2050, defining decade. CO2 emissions from the energy sector are key. Energy sector contributes, depending on whose study you believe, but all of them show that it is at least 60%, but most studies say the energy system, production and use of energy is above 70%. So you cannot solve climate change without a major energy revolution. Major energy revolution. So I'm almost back to my advocacy days 15 years ago as I was going around the world making that case. What is also important here, the very rich countries, the G20 countries, account for 75% of these emissions, compared to Africa's 4%. And if you break down African countries, you'll see that it is much less for countries like mine, Sierra Leone. So whatever we do in terms of lowering emissions this decade, the biggest responsibility lies on those who have polluted the most and are more advanced and have the resources, the G20 countries. Next slide, please. I serve on the board of the Rocky Mountain Institute, and it's been a privilege for me to serve on that board. As you know, in the Futures Lab, top researchers, and they're collaborating with partners all over the world. They have projects in China, in India, in Africa, and so on, and also in the United States. So with their permission, I took 3 of their slides from the Electrification Center that is looking at scenarios of how we can decarbonize the electrical system. The first graph there on the left shows indeed over time, emissions across the energy systems have been increasing over time, in spite of the rhetoric, in spite of all the claims. Everybody is concerned about climate change, but in fact, when it comes to energy systems, we've not done as much as we should. And you can see at the bottom there that providing electricity, power generation, accounts for 41%. So whatever we do, we have to tackle how we produce energy if we want to be on that trajectory to net zero by 2050. On the right-hand side, you can see that coal is still the big polluter, followed by gas and oil. And in fact, the Secretary General 2 weeks ago called for zero investments in coal. And many environmental groups around the world are calling for that. That in fact, right now, we should stop any new investments in coal. Well, that's what we want. But as you and I know, several countries, India, China, Turkey, Indonesia, South Africa, others, they have plans to build more. That's for energy security, but we'll talk a little bit about that. But if we want to get immediate impact, Secretary General and others are saying zero coal from now on. Some people even say that Glasgow, we're hoping we get those major announcements that in fact, most of those countries will not invest in new coal-fired plants. We wait and see. Next slide. What has progress been across countries and regions? How are we doing, knowing that, yes, we want to reduce emissions by 50% this decade? Of course, the big emitters are still China, US, and India. Others are there as well. Europe is doing reasonably well. If you look at the slide in the middle, you can see that for the rich OECD countries, they've made a significant effort. The yellow bars there, you can see coal investments going down. Gas has held steady. But you can see the top blue, that a lot of investments in renewables. They're making efforts, no doubt about it. The second graph on the right shows the developing countries and emerging economies. There you can see coal has been going up. It is also holding steady. We don't see much reduction over time. Gas is growing as well. But what is important here, thanks to those developing countries, we've seen even more massive deployment of renewables. It is clear that, in fact, the advocacy over the last 20 years, the last 15 years, the last 10, we have seen developing countries themselves picking up renewables, understanding that it's also in their interest for social inclusion, for economic growth, and in fact, leapfrogging, that they should also invest in clean energy solutions. However, with all these efforts there, it's not enough. Next slide, please. We look now into electrification. On the left there, you see deep solar is king, but we're not quite there yet. The graph on the right-hand side shows where benchmarking against 2018, what the situation was. But the right bar shows what we need to do by 2050. You can see that orange middle, that we almost have to more than quadruple investments in clean energy systems. And here, when we say clean energy systems in the power sector, it's not just the solar panels and the windmills. We're also talking about batteries. We're also talking about energy efficiency as well. That needs to more than quadruple for solar, for wind, significant portions of hydro as well. But basically, the message here is, it is urgent. We're not doing as much as we need to do. We already know from the left graph there that the technologies are known, the business models are known. We've already seen some progress. We know what to do. We've made significant progress in deploying clean technology, clean energy technologies. We know the business models as well. So as we head for Glasgow, the question is, what do we expect? What has countries committed so far, and how do they stack up against what needs to be done? Next slide, please. So the road to Glasgow, rhetoric versus reality. Last week, the International Energy Agency launched the World Energy Outlook 2021. They already show that, in fact, we are this year going to set a record to have the second largest increase in emissions ever. The Climate Transparency Report, also 2021, which was also launched after Fatih launched his report at the International Energy Agency, also state that last year, 2020, was one of the hottest years on record, and the last decade, 2010 to 2019, was the hottest ever. UNEP, Annual Emissions Gap Report, they look at all the commitments that countries have made in their nationally determined commitments, whether they stack up, and they are also saying what has been announced by countries and world leaders is not enough. Others, next slide, also make the same claim, that in fact UNFCCC also says we're not on track to net zero. What also in the synthesis reports that UNFCCC did, they showed that most countries now have the habit of target setting for 2050 or 2060. So they say we will hit net zero by 2050 or 2060 and just make small commitments for this decade. And remember what I said, this is the decade, the decisive decade where the actions are to be taken. So we see the long-term targets, very ambitious, but the near-term action we don't see in terms of policies and real investments. Laura Cozy, who is the chief modeler for the International Energy Agency, last week said, we can be optimistic because we know the technologies. The resources are available in the very rich countries. We have political leaders that want to do it. She says, however, and I quote her, we are going to Glasgow not with the glass half full, but 80% empty. Why is that the case? Next slide, please. The International Energy Agency analysis showed that all the commitments put together before going to Glasgow, and these are the commitments they tabulated up to April, May this year, will only account for 20% of the emissions reduction we need, only 20%. So in spite of Biden's leadership, Angela Merkel's leadership, Xi Jinping's leadership, those in Japan and the whole EU Green Deal, the commitments are only 20% of what we need. In fact, people say this will only reduce emissions probably by a mere 23 gigatons. What is also interesting when you look at the G20 countries, the use of coal will go up by 5% according to the climate transparency report that tracks what happens in G20. Gas will go up by 12% this year, the demand for gas. I put a circle around gas for good reason. In the last 1 month, I have been having strong arguments, including last week in 2 forums. There are those who are now campaigning that African countries should not be allowed to invest in gas. That in fact, the World Bank and the African Development Bank and other international donors should not finance gas-fired plants in Africa. Is that really justice? You are increasing your investments in gas. Some are even investing more in coal. And the very poor countries that are most vulnerable to climate change, that are emitting 4% or less, you say they cannot invest in gas. Does that make sense to anybody morally in terms of climate justice or energy justice? I leave that for you to decide, but this is evidence from those who do analysis on what the rich countries are planning to do this year and next year. And these are some of their best think tanks. I'm sure the Futures Lab, you also have your own numbers. The next slide, you remember during COVID-19 last year, we were all saying build back better. Next slide, please. I was on many panels myself, the IMF World Bank Parliamentary Forum, International Renewable Energy Forums, many. In fact, I was involved in almost 30 forums from last year to now, where we're talking about build back better. Well, let's look at the evidence. Next slide, please. Build back better. Yeah, it's this one. When the Climate Transparency Report looked at all the commitment, IEA has similar numbers. The International Energy Agency has similar numbers. Of the 14.2 trillion in all the monies put into the stimulus packages for rescuing the economies, the healthcare systems, the households, and also for investing in Build Back Better, only 1.8 trillion went into real recovery. And that was the hope many of us had, that more will go into recovery, which means these are the medium and longer term efforts you want to make sure that the economy and the energy systems are built differently. Yeah, that's part of the Build Back Better. And of the 1.8 trillion, only 300 billion actually went into real green investments. Some of them were just greenwashing, but 3 billion went into a green recovery. What is also interesting is there's a similar amount, almost 300 billion, was spent on fossil sector subsidies. So a friend of mine said, so Kandeh, who is fooling who? Are we as green as we want to be, or we claim countries should be? Is it a case of do as I say, not as I do? Good question. But the reality is, of course, there are vested interests in many sectors to keep things the way they are. There's also the reality that there are adjustment costs. It's not that people don't want to do it. There are investments that have been made over time, structural changes required, even behavioral change. You and I, the citizens who enjoy the air conditioning, the fast cars, and so on, we also have to change. So the transition is not easy. Meanwhile, you have to try to wean people off what they are used to for almost a century now. So those adjustment costs and also adjustment challenges, and also the politics. What I have learned in my over 2 decades in this area, at the macro level, global level, and now locally in my own small country, the politics of energy is still very complicated, tough. And you need bold leaders who will say, we will do it and this is how, but you got to bring people along and you got to bring the vested interest along. So the conclusion I want to give in this first 30% of my discussion with you is, it is urgent. We're not doing as much as we should do. We know the technologies, we have the means. The rich countries can do much more than they're doing, but we have to make it just. We have to take into consideration the transition costs, and also we have to support the developing countries in their own transition. Which makes me take, next slide, the second school of thought about what a just transition means. These are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. from reducing poverty to making hunger zero, to good health, education, gender equality, clean water, and so on, including even democracy and social justice and human rights. These are the commitments we made in 2015 to the rest of the world. I was part of that. I served in two major important committees that the Secretary General relied on to move the politics of this forward. I was in the ad hoc committee set up to look at how we go to Rio + 20 in Brazil back in 2012. I was part of the team also advising the Secretary General on the negotiations after 2012 to see how we can arrive at these 17 goals. I had a personal responsibility and honor to lead the effort on 7 and 9. I'll not talk a lot about 9 today, but I just want to make the case that for developing countries, industrialization, infrastructure, and economic growth and prosperity of their people is important. Basically, what do they want? What do poor countries and developing countries want? They want to wear the same clothes you wear in England. They want to live the same lifestyles you live in England. Remember, it was us in the UN who also said to, and in the World Bank, in the multilateral system, we said to developing countries, if you democratize, if you liberalize your economies, the reward is your economies will grow and your lifestyle will be like us, the rich OECD countries. We had to spread that gospel for 30 years. So now we cannot say to them, slow down your own transformation because of climate change, but we continue to pollute as much as we do. So Sustainable Development Goal number 9 is crucial. I spent many years as Director General of UNIDO, two-time Director General, driving that. But at the same time, I had the realization, you can't industrialize, you can't have effective structural change in your economies without reliable, affordable energy services. Next slide, please. So we fought for Sustainable Development Goal number 7. Many institutions partnered with us, helped us out, and we were able to achieve it. Next slide. Yeah. So we set 3 targets. It was very difficult to negotiate, very, very difficult. In fact, when we started insisting on a Sustainable Development Goal on energy, I used to make this mistake in those early times, around 2006, 2007. I used to say green energy, and I was quickly called to book by some powerful countries that it is not green energy, it is energy. So in developing Sustainable Goal number 7, we had to come up with a political narrative that was acceptable to the United States, to China, and the BRICS in general, to the Middle East oil producers, and also to the developing countries. So the compromise rhetoric and political narrative we developed was energy for development, energy for development. So the first target we said universal access for all. All those who need access to electricity should have it. At that time, it was 1.7 billion people without electricity. Today, we've done very well. In almost a decade, we've been able to drop that to about 750 million. So we dropped it by almost half, but that's thanks to India and China and a few other emerging economies. In Africa, still over 600 million without power. We also said we want to double the share of renewables in the global energy mix. We were dreaming of getting a 30% global share of renewables in the energy mix. The best estimate put the current mix probably at 15, 17%. So we're not there yet. We also, this is important, we wanted to double the annual rates of improvement of energy efficiency. At that time, when we were lobbying for this, the annual rate of improvement was about 1.7%. We wanted to make it 2.4%. Currently, some studies show that it is still about 1% or 1.2%. OECD countries have not done well. In fact, 2 years ago, the International Energy set up a new commission to look at energy efficiency. How do we drive it? I served on that commission and also someone from South Africa representing the Africans. So these were the targets. If we do this correctly, estimates are we'll lower emissions probably by 30% alone. So the ambition for net zero may not be met by these targets, but they need to be met, especially universal access to energy. Next slide. you begin to understand why. Next slide again, the next one. You begin to understand why. Therefore, in New York 2 weeks ago, people said, hey, we don't only want to talk about climate. We want to talk about climate, but we want to talk about the billions in the global south that are also trying to run their health services, get access to clean water, grow their economies, and create jobs. They need power, sustainable, reliable, affordable power. Therefore, we must achieve SDG 7 as well, and also the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals. So I shift to Africa. This is our reality. The picture you see there on the left, that's a pregnant woman in my village. I took that picture with my iPhone. That's around 3, 4 in the afternoon in my village. She's coming home from the farm with firewood on her head. She's going to use that firewood for cooking. If you shift to the second picture there, that's a woman in an Asian country cooking, a lot of smoke. And we insist, again, it happened 2 weeks ago in New York, that when we talk about energy access in developing countries, it's not just electrification, it's also access to clean cooking solutions. If you look at the African case, 900 million people without modern energy cooking services, and another 900 million projected to be without access to electricity by 2030. This is serious. So to make the case, it's about electrification, but it's also about access to clean cooking. Next slide, please. What drives the, next slide, please. So the African situation, we have to make sure that energy access is central, and I'll give more reasons why. We have to raise installed capacity from 90 gigawatts to about 380 gigawatts. It is key, and the International Energy Agency did a special Africa World Energy Outlook in 2019. I served as an advisor to them in finishing that report. These are their numbers of the current situation and where we need to be, hopefully by 2040. Next slide, please. Africa has a lot of energy resources. We are the best location for solar power, but less than 1% of solar investments go to Africa. Current capacity total that we have is between 5 to 7 gigawatts in all of Africa. If you take South Africa out, very few. But what drives our energy transition? This may be similar to India, for example, and some other regions as well. Our demographics, and this is where I say to the rest of the world, especially folks in Europe, it is in your vested interest to pay attention to this. Africa will add another billion people to our population by 2050. Will be 2 billion, 2.2 billion. If we have 620 without access to electricity now, and then we're adding another billion, it means in our transition for you, the analysts in the future lab, you should be planning for 1.6 billion people, right? If we're looking at 2050, that's what you should be planning for. And I say to people, it's very urgent. In addition to that, about 500 million people will move into African cities by 2040. And according to the International Energy Agency, the World Bank and others, that rate of urbanization has not been seen before in the world. It is even faster than China's 2 decades of major industrial transformation. How much rural urban migration took place. But remember, in the case of China, that migration was preceded by industrialization. In our African case, no. People are moving in. And when you add the risk of climate change, more people will move into cities with no electricity, lack of clean water, no jobs. We need to generate about 1 million jobs every month in Africa to meet that kind of demographic pressure, jobs for the youth. Some of our countries have 50, 60% youth unemployment. What does that mean for you in Europe? Waves of migrants. Waves of migrants. I say to I lived in Central Europe almost 20 years, and I say to my friends, I've done presentations there on migration and other issues. I say it's in your vested interest that we accelerate energy transitions, but we create wealth in the South. A win-win investment scenario, not a charity case. This is not about charity now. This is real investments. Because if you don't, we move up. Our grandchildren will move up north. And you want them to come as paying tourists, not illegally migrants. Look at the demand for vehicles. It's going to double or triple. It's a huge market opportunity. Yeah. Economic growth, our economy might quadruple. If you look at similar numbers for India, it is scary too. Yeah. India's demand for vehicles will increase by a factor of 4. India's energy demand will increase by a factor of 6 in the next 25 years. They still need to build about 70% more infrastructure and housing over the next 30 years in India. They also need to create 1 million jobs a month. These pressures are real for politicians, but also for global security and stability. Next slide. Africa is not only a problem case now, a challenging case. It is also the home to most of the minerals that are needed for the global energy transition. Lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese, graphite, we have them in Africa. Huge deposits that everybody else needs for the battery systems that we need to store the clean energy. Copper and silicon and silver for solar PV. Copper and aluminum for the grid extensions and transmission lines we need. The rare earth metals for the smart grids we need, and of course for our computers and iPhones. In some cases, we account for very significant quantities. In fact, the International Energy Agency has done a special study, and the Pine Institute and also the Colorado School of Mines, I have some friends there. They've also looked at these critical minerals needed for global transitions, energy transitions, for new energy technologies, but also for storage systems. Some of them are showing that in the case of some of these minerals, the demand will increase by a factor of 6 if we are to meet net zero. In the case of lithium, i.e. the International Energy Agency in May this year said, the demand will increase by 75%. Well, we are home to it. The message I want to give here is, we don't just want to be sources of raw materials. We want to be part of the global value chain that produces the batteries. If you take cobalt, a country like Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, when you hear about it in the news, you hear about problems. People are not talking about the cobalt that is being taken out. They're not talking about the manganese. And of course, they're sitting on uranium and lithium too. You look at South Africa, 75% of the world's platinum group of metals that are crucial for hydrogen fuel cells. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen is the future. Well, we can be leaders in those. South Africa can be a leader in green hydrogen. They have the capacity to invest in renewables to produce hydrogen and also create the battery systems. But the rest of us can produce those batteries for the rest of us. Zimbabwe is sitting on huge quantities of lithium as well. So in short, I'm saying it is urgent in Africa for the global energy transitions, for prosperity, for jobs, for stability. But it's also important if we look at these precious minerals we all need if the transition would work. Otherwise, price hikes for these minerals will also cause a slowdown in the transition. Next slide, please. I'm getting close to the end now. COVID indeed affected energy transitions around the world. It affected supply chains for solar products around the world, just like everything else. In the case of Africa, which is bullet number 5, according to the International Energy Agency, we immediately saw a drop of 30% in investments in the energy sector. Remember, we don't have enough to start with, and we don't have the means to finance all what needs to be done, and yet investments drop radically like that. Imagine the challenge of scaling that back. In fact, the World Bank and the UN already say we are beginning to lose all the gains we made in the last 15, 20 years in providing access to energy in Africa. And of course, our lending costs have also gone up. Now we see all these problems with supply chains. It's hitting us heavy. But also, what did COVID do? And I was in several platforms also sharing and facilitating sessions on this nexus between energy and health. We preached about it for so long, but finally it hit home because people realized that without decentralized energy systems, you can't get those vaccines in the rural areas. Last week, for your information, I was in one of the most remote areas in my country promoting the vaccines. And I can tell you, When the truck came with the vaccines, I was saying to myself, I hope they maintain the temperature, because they didn't have solar panels. They just had styrofoam boxes where where the vaccines were stored. So COVID made it clear for us now, this connection between energy and health, energy and water and sanitation, because during the lockdown, some poor countries could not even pump water to have clean water available in cities. Next slide. So the end of my presentation. Summary and conclusions. From point number 1 to 6, it's the normal advice that the Future Lab will give to leaders around the world, given the good analysis that you do. We need to do more. We have to increase clean energy investments by almost a factor of 4, quadruple what we're doing now. There's a lot of hope, good news about electric vehicles. Currently 6% of all new vehicles, but that needs to go up to about 60% if we want to do net zero. We also have to decarbonize industry. That's important for developing countries that are trying to industrialize. It's important, for example, in India and China. And so in some cases, some analysts are saying electrify industry. Yeah, so they don't have to use heavy fuel oil, HFOs and so on to generate their own power. To push for industrial energy efficiency as well. And I mentioned already, we have to increase energy efficiency by a factor of 4. A little story on that. When we were trying to develop Sustainable Development Goal number 7, in China, in a meeting I was involved in, I was going around asking, and then I launched it in the plenary, by how much should we ask the world to increase the rate of improvement of energy efficiency? Most of the environmentalists wanted a factor of 4, but the reality is we only push for a factor of 2 to double the rate, because we thought it was unrealistic. Well, 12, 13 years later, everybody is saying that's where we really need to be if we want to do net zero. Number 4 is important. In order to have more energy access in developing countries, we have to do a lot of work. Regulations matter. And right now, with the Florence School of Regulations, the World Bank, and the MIT, several other partners, Sustainable Energy for All as well, NL Foundation, we're trying to establish an African School of Regulations. We hope we'll launch that later this year. A lot of training is required. Why you, the Futures Lab, you are important for capacity building along the value chain. We need energy planning tools. We need to establish new transmission systems that will allow energy trade between countries. We need to innovate. And your analytics will be crucial in the planning processes for this country. The innovation is not just about new technologies. It is also policy innovation. For some of these countries to design a feed-in tariff is not easy. We are talking about integrated planning now. You plan for grid expansion, at the same time you plan for off-grid and mini-grid locations. You need some analytical power and training for these countries to be able to do that. And of course, you need greater international cooperation if we're going to solve these problems, and knowledge sharing. That's where Futures Lab and other institutions like yours come in, to share data, to share information, but also joint courses. And I hope later on I'll talk to you about our School of Regulations. Probably you'll want to be part of it. Last slide. In the last slide, other ideas, some of these I've picked from other colleagues as well. But the one I want to focus on mainly is really 7 and 8. We have to influence the politicians. Energy policy, energy transitions is a sensitive issue. Very difficult for even the rich countries to navigate. I mean, when I see on television now, people all worried about a few cents increase in oil prices. I say, come to my neighborhood. We get fluctuations in our basic pump price by 30%. Yeah, and that affects everything else. What am I saying here? We need to convince the politicians, the presidents, the ministers of energy, what we mean by a just energy transition. We need to convince the utility leaders. They have to include just equitable transition as part of design, not as an afterthought. They just want the grid. Oh, it is good for the president to cut the ribbon and open a new power. They are not talking about the other issues that you and I care about. Will people have real access? Will the access be only for 3 hours, or is it for 8 hours? What we call reliable access. So in order to convince the leaders, this is something I picked from some other analysts. They say, look, and I'm a politician myself now, at least for now, is what do they want to know? They want to know what works. Where has it worked? What are the costs of adjustment? What will it cost me? What are the trade-offs? Well, I don't know how to do the planning for the whole economy and include energy systems. So these are some of the questions as you do your analysis. You have to translate your analytics to answer these questions for leaders. And finally, labor issues. How do we navigate the economies and communities where coal is king right now? South Africa has some locations they call coal cities. Of course, Poland has the same challenge, or in India. How do we deal with those labor issues and social safety net? And finally, money, money, money. The 100 billion pledged per year is just a drop in the bucket. What we're talking about is $4 trillion, not $100 billion for the energy transition. I hope I've been helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kandeh. Thank you. We are extremely grateful for a very insightful and thought-provoking lecture that made all of us to think deeply about important issues. You have also kindly given us great insights with regards to discussions that happen in private rooms that most of us do not normally have access and do not have the privilege to observe. Our colleagues, I'm sure, are putting questions in the chat, and while they are warming up, I will ask you. I will take privilege of my position, and I will ask you the first question, if you allow me. So, thank you. At the very beginning, you painted a reasonably grim picture about an 80% half or more than half empty glass with regards to how ready we are for COP26. I was going to ask you, what do you think success would look like given this starting point, that we have so little commitment at this point? And do you think that success has a different color for developing nations and developed nations?
To answer the last part, yes, it will have a different color for poorer countries than for richer countries. It will have a different color for some of the emerging economies. Some emerging economies are almost similar to European countries, so maybe the colors will be the same. But what will success look like? If you take the G20, based on what I know from International Energy Agency and others, up to April, May this year, only 14 countries had made commitments to net zero. They had a clear net zero target and a clear net zero plan. But only 7 had gone to parliaments for legislation. So one success would be all G20 committing to net zero with real ambitious targets and also determination that they're going to their parliaments to get those commitments approved by their parliaments. That is important. Second success will be, you know, I was in Copenhagen when we promised the poor countries 100 billion per year. I remember that morning I was on CNN, Christiana Mampour interviewed me. Are you confident there will be a pledge when the heads of states arrive? And I mean, as a global leader then, I had to pressure them that yes, we're confident. Well, we're still asking for that same 100 billion today. So since Copenhagen, it's a long time. We want to see real money on the table to help the poor, the victims of climate change, deal with it. As Provost said at the beginning, we in Africa live climate change already. We're living it. In my country, up to last night, it was raining heavy. Normally, by October, it doesn't rain around this time. By November, we're not talking rain. And it's raining heavily, suddenly, all in one go, for an hour and it's gone. But then it comes the next day. So yes, money on the table, more commitments from the very rich, and some near-term policy actions announced as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for this. Now, I can see there is a question by one of our colleagues, Bill Lee, on the chat, who is asking you if you believe that nuclear power has a significant role to play in the energy transition, or should we rely primarily on renewable wind and solar energy?
Many of us have come around to accepting that in this transition period, yes, nuclear has to play a role. In fact, Bill Gates already said that 15 years ago, the race to zero. He has a nice equation that he developed at that time, 15 years ago. He said, look, all the technologies available today will not be able to give us enough clean energy solutions to lower emissions when the world population is 9 billion. And Bill Gates bet on a version of nuclear power. And I'm hearing from a number of people that yes, for this transition period, until we get to the solar, wind, clean hydrogen, green hydrogen we're dreaming about, nuclear is part of that equation, yes.
And I was going to extend a little bit this question and say that here in the UK, there is quite a lot of discussion about having solutions that are locally tailored. We work with a concept that is focusing on industrial decarbonization in clusters, and we look at resources and requirements in different regions. Now, obviously, the developing nations are much bigger, and you focused quite a bit on Africa, and so does a little bit that there are differences in resources and the opportunities, although solar is common everywhere. Do you think that the different nations are more ready to accept available solutions in a different rate across Africa, for example? And do you think that solutions can have a local nature and this local nature can be achieved fast enough?
Indeed, solutions have to be domesticated and localized, given the socioeconomic context of countries. The industrial sectors, of course, that they also want to power matters. For some of our more agrarian economies, I see a good nexus of energy access and agribusiness development. Yeah. Remember, there's another problem. Again, why the Sustainable Development Goals matter. The Food and Agriculture Organization and other concerned groups about food security already say that by 2050, we need to increase food production by 70%. So this nexus of energy and agriculture for some developing countries, if you're looking at which industries, is going to be crucial for irrigation, for processing, for storage, so that you can extend the shelf life of food, but also for economic development. It is also important for women. In my country and some of the sub-Saharan African countries, women do 80% of the food processing after harvest. Yeah, and a lot of that requires energy solutions along the value chain. And in the more advanced countries, in the case of South Africa and others, of course, I've been in South Africa in my last role in the UN, doing a number of forums on energy efficiency. You know, South Africa has pioneered very well renewable energy auctions. They've done well, 3-4 US cents per kilowatt hour. They've done very well. So but remember, they can leapfrog now into green hydrogen energy. Yeah, they can leapfrog into hydrogen fuel cells. And I can tell you, I was there. COVID has prevented our trips now, but I participated in the Energy in Daba in South Africa last year. I also organized some side events for them. But already they're looking at hydrogen energy big time, and they're looking at fuel cells. So, but in Congo, I go back to poor country Congo. I see no reason why either in Congo or neighboring Zambia, we should not see Elon Musk investing in battery plants. We have the manganese and the cobalt and other things you need for the batteries. Why not Zimbabwe or South Africa or Zambia or Congo itself? And these, why I push the industrialization agenda for Africa, it's about jobs, it's about wealth creation, and it is win-win. Our labor costs will be, you train those labor, and the raw material is close to you. And then we get the logistics to ship out to the rest of the world.
Lovely. And this relates to a question that has been posted a moment ago by one of our anonymous colleagues, and distinguishes the two issues, the practical energy dependency that you described in terms of cooking in your lecture. And here in Europe, and especially today in the UK, there has been quite a lot of discussion about heating and domestic heating. And in contrast, the economic energy dependency supporting quality of life and development, like industrial development. How do you distinguish between these two objectives? Is it just a regional issue, or do you think there is a little bit of a conflict or a competition for energy between those two separate objectives?
Well, if it is the objective of heating and cooling, of course, we have seen in the case of the United States, probably some parts of Europe, 30 to 40% of the emissions come from heating and cooling of buildings. So the whole issue of heating and cooling of buildings matter for those advanced countries if they want to lower emissions. So energy efficiency driving that. Today, from one of the literature I was looking, we need to increase energy efficiency in buildings and to retrofit buildings as well. It should scale up probably 1 in 5 instead of 1 in 20 as we see. So in my mind, that's not competition. That's the reality of those regions. For Sierra Leone, for Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, for India with 700 million people without clean cooking solutions, for Bangladesh, for Indonesia, for those countries and a few in Central America, clean cooking is an important dimension. It's a source of black carbon. It is causing massive deforestation. But more importantly, it is causing 4 million premature deaths every year, worse than HIV, AIDS, malaria, and TB combined. That's a lot of people dying. And 60% of them are women and children. So I would not call them competing interests because the socioeconomic development of the regions and the countries vary. But perhaps if you go back to heating and cooling of buildings, it matters for India. In fact, the Climate Transparency Report says there will be 200 million Indians living in areas where there's acute temperature rise. In Africa, there's an estimate of probably 500 million of us by 2040 will also live in similar areas. Well, we need air conditioning. One of the areas that constitutes a huge demand for energy in India is electric fans. You know, I used to go there a lot to visit Terry in those days, the Energy Resources Institute. You should go there and look at their studies on electric fans and how much energy they suck from the system, from the grids.
Thank you. And you also mentioned quite a lot in your lecture the opportunity for resources extraction in developing countries, raw materials that we need in our economies. From my experience, one country common in our in my visits and my research, South Africa, is using quite a lot of its coal to power the extraction of raw materials and the smelting of raw materials so that value can be added. Do you think that there are opportunities for them to actually electrify or switch to greener sources when a raw material that is cheap? How can we incentivize them? Other methods we can use to incentivize them to switch to different sources for their electricity in a safe and reliable way?
Yeah, the South Africa story is a tough one. Yeah, 74% of their total primary energy comes from coal. 87% of their power depends on coal. But as you said, they also liquefy coal to use in industry and in mining. For them, it's a tough challenge, but they've already shown some success, as I said. They've already shown that auctions, they can have cheap renewable energy. But again, for them, still renewable energy is probably 6% or less of their power mix. So a lot to do there. During my visits when I was at the UN, I worked very closely with the Minister of Energy and our team. I did a number of energy conferences for them, for industry on energy and the mining sector as well, looking at how they manage energy demand. So a lot of push for energy efficiency. I remember once we had a dinner where we had to have the companies line up to sign a compact, a social compact with the nation about and setting targets for the energy efficiency. And my organization did some training there. So energy efficiency is going to be crucial for them to manage demand. And of course, incentivizing them means also multilateral cooperation. Remember, a few years ago, some countries blocked South Africa when they wanted to do a power plant. But those countries that blocked South Africa could do that because South Africa needed to borrow money from the World Bank. Meanwhile, the countries that blocked South Africa were investing in coal in their countries because they don't have to ask anybody. So we need some honesty here. and multilateral cooperation to say to South Africa, the market is there, you have the right institutions, you've done well, there's money to be made in your country, it's a good emerging economy, we'll invest with you. And of course, if you get South Africa right, with the right transmission lines, you can supply SADC. You can help them integrate better with their neighboring country. South Africa can buy gas from Mozambique, for example. They already buy some hydropower from Lesotho and other countries. But so it's these win-win business models that will bring bigger social impact and environmental impact that we should be looking for post-COVID, but also post-Glasgow. That countries will say, in our enlightened self-interest, we help South Africa build that pipeline from Mozambique to South Africa to supply the gas. We help the Nigerians put gas finally in the West Africa gas pipeline, and so that Cote d'Ivoire can also supply that gas, so Sierra Leone and Guinea and Liberia and Togo can have the electricity they need just to survive. You see, regional cooperation also becomes important there.
Yes, and as an economist, and also considering all these wonderful insights you have given us, do you think that the carbon price could actually facilitate something like that? If it is of global or of regional nature, could it actually push the transition fast?
Yeah, I've always been convinced in my early journey into the energy space. One of the groups that really helped me a lot understand energy systems were the Norwegians. They wanted me to understand energy systems so much that they even flew me to the North Sea, the Sleipner oil rig. And also when they were experimenting with floating windmills that they use now later on to invest in the UK. And I went to Bergen to see carbon capture and storage. What am I saying? One of the things I learned from them is, look, they've always had a tax on carbon. And yet the oil companies are profitable there. So in those days in the UN, I used to say, hey, how come you can accept a carbon tax up north, but you come down to Nigeria and you don't even want to talk about reducing gas flaring? Yeah. One of the last events I did in the UN and World Bank in 2015, April 2015 in the World Bank, we launched an initiative on zero flaring of gas in oil fields. It still exists today, but why did we do it? The gas that was flared in Africa at that time, already in 2015, could have powered half of the energy needs we needed in Africa, but people would burn it, which they did not do in the North Sea. In the North Sea, they only do it because of technical reasons. So yes, carbon tax will help a whole lot to change the incentives, especially from coal. And we need to do that. That's where you need the bold political leadership. And in all of this, if I leave you with one key message, politics matters. Politics matters. I used to say you have to align 4 Ps: the politics, the policy, the pricing, and public-private partnerships. If you don't get those 4 Ps in line, your energy transition would not work locally or globally.
Wonderful. Thank you. I agree completely with you. Thank you for this key message that we keep our ears open, and we will try to do our best also from Imperial and from Energy Futures Lab to support this. Now, one of our colleagues has said in the chat, and we're getting towards to the end of our discussion, we don't want to tire you too much. How do you think universities like Imperial should work with developing nations to ensure a just energy transition? What can we do to support your objectives, perhaps better than we currently do?
Yeah, knowledge sharing matters. I mentioned to you already, in your case, I'll be approaching you on the African School of Regulations we're trying to launch. We'll send you the documents. We're still asking partner institutions that have tools, courses that they can offer, analytics that they can feed into those courses. That's one. Second, I believe that, I know after Glasgow, there will be announcements for funding for research. Send some of that research work down south. And my center will be very happy to partner with some of you, because these countries need evidence. If you take clean cooking, some of our leaders still see this as a small problem. They can't fit, because a clean cooking sector is so fragmented. Some of them even say, it's a woman's problem. No, it is a societal and development problem. So the analytics to show evidence, the analytics to show what has worked elsewhere and how it has worked, I think will be very powerful in the energy planning models that some of these countries want to adopt. And, so getting that research money, but making the case that some of the research should be down south. Also, one crucial issue. Sometimes you will hear a lot of pledges of monies that are available for developing countries. Project design is a big headache. The monies are there, but the data to help you develop the first project, to get it in the pipeline, is not there, or the funding for the pre-investment stages, environmental impact assessment, financial design of projects, the actual project design. Sometimes it's 2-3 years to get a big solar plant. The countries do not have that money. So I think universities like yours, knowledge sharing is important, but also one of your other partner institutions call it embedding people in the ministry with that analytical power. So the minister knows there is next door somebody who can give them the evidence, who can give them the analysis and the evidence that they can take when they're arguing with the Minister of Finance or with a team, discussing with a team from the World Bank. So you are very crucial for us.
Thank you, Kandeh. And of course, while our provost is listening, I will say that clearly we have very good links, and several of our colleagues, including my co-director, Professor Tim Green, with many African nations. But clearly we feel we ought to do more, and we will love the opportunity to work with you closer and also develop further our advocacy skills, not only in the African countries, but as Alexandra also mentioned in another point in the call, advocacy and the role in education of young children, especially in Europe and North America, so we shift the mentality of overconsumption and consider a lot more the priorities of the world as a whole, rather than personal priorities or family priorities or small regional priorities. Now, she also wrote something else that is quite important, and I would like to use as a closing remark. And I would like to thank you on behalf of Alexandra and the Energy Futures Lab, all of us in the audience, for one of the most inspiring talks we have ever attended. And we are extremely grateful you gave up your time to come and join us on this opportunity. And we promise that in the future, in the near future, we are going to look and develop opportunities to work closer with developing nations and take a strong stance and support of developing nations in the transition to a greener, more sustainable energy for all people around the world. Thank you again for
Thank you for having me.